Now, next up, we go again to, intelligent people I started talking about earlier. And it was just amazing to me yesterday when Jen was talking, and I know every now and then I have to do this, see what's next on the list. Did you notice she rarely did that? We had lunch with her the other day, and Lori would ask her a question about Millie or a question about Nancy Drew, and there were no notes. And Jen would just start talking and tell you all these wonderful facts, and I was just like, wow, you just know that off the top of your head? That's impressive. That's amazing. So that's one of those things that rubs off. So she took, something that was a hobby for her, turned it into a business or a vocation. And if you were paying attention yesterday, you know how old she was when she did that, right? How old was she? 10, that's right. Now, I won't be unmannerly or ungentlemanly or anything and talk about her age, but we've been doing it 25 years, so if you could, you do the math and you'll know how old she is. So we're going to hear from her again, and I want to give a little bit. Anybody who may not have been here yesterday, but an amazing person who has put this and not only turned it into vocation, but it's her passion, her commitment, and her joy. And that's why she's able to just sit there and answer those questions and tell us so much information without having to have a note or look at a note. So the Millie appointed president of Nancy Drew Sleuths, Jen Fisher. You ready?
Apparently I've cornered the fountain of youth. Okay, so briefly before, get this over here. You guys hear me okay back there? Just making sure. Okay. So kind of like I did yesterday, but we have some new people here today. I'm just going to go through a couple of things before I get into my talk. We recently launched an initiative called the Mildred Wirt Benson HARP project. It's the Historical Artifacts Recovery Project. And the gist of that is that we want to rehome, reclaim, bring in documents and artifacts and historical memorabilia related to Mildred Wirt Benson and Nancy Drew for the archive here, the archive in Iowa, where they have Millie's papers. There's a lot of items that are in private hands out there that would be wonderful to preserve history of children's literature and specifically what Millie wrote, to also archive and properly, preserve these items, but also make them available for research and for scholars and just fans to learn a little bit more about the history and appreciate it. And so there will be more being added to my website, which you can see is nancydrewsleuth.com. If you have anything related to Nancy Drew, Mildred Wirt Benson, if you're a local Toledoan here today, and you have anything that might be really nice for the rare book room here and the collection, please reach out to the library. You can also reach out to me because we're actively looking for memorabilia, and it's definitely going to be a project that's near and dear to my heart, but also all of you guys. Recently, and it's on display over in the Nancy Drew collection room outside of there. We recently acquired 2 pages of a 3-page plot that she wrote back in the 1920s for Edward Stratemeyer. And it's very historic, very, very rare, scarce item. Basically, Stratemeyer would farm things out to the ghostwriters and they would work on his plots. But he actually asked Millie to send him a plot idea, an outline. And of course, so she did, which was unusual, but he really appreciated her writing. And of course, he rejected it for it allegedly being a bit too wild. Now, back in the 20s, times were a little different, but if you read through the outline that's in the frames up there, the 2 pages that exist, I don't know if you'll discover what's so wild about it, but page 2 is missing, so there's always a possibility it was on page 2 that he didn't like. So, but it was a really neat historic item that had been in private hands for about 30 years, and we were able to acquire it for the project. So, and I donated it here to the Toledo Public Library this week. There's also my collection that's here that was donated, and that also ties in. There's a fund that was just created for my collection here, and to also kind of coincide with the Mildred Rourke Benson Heart Project. And so we're using the fund to promote the collection, to expand it for items that are scarce or that I don't have yet in the collection, you know, because I was 10 when I donated it. So there's always items I'm looking for that just pop up, things you don't even know exist sometimes. So a fund will help that. A fund will help expand the collection, the cabinetry, the displays, archive more things, digitize, which is really important, so that people that can't visit in person can, you know, go online and be able to view items from the collection, and so on and so forth. So if you are feeling generous, we would definitely appreciate a donation. Every little bit helps for the fund. We've had several really nice donations this week, and I really appreciate all of you who have done that and want to support this collection and this endeavor. It just means a lot to me. Just a little bit about myself. How do you go from a Nancy Drew fan, a little girl that grows up reading these books, to being an expert who can just recite facts, as Ellen said. You know, I've just talked about it for so many years. It just sticks. But back in 2000, the Nancy Drew Sleuths formed as a fan group online. And then thanks to Millie, I became the president, and we just sort of started formally organizing. We started having conventions every year. We published a zine called The Sleuth, and we started doing merchandising and working with Simon & Schuster. We officially licensed Nancy Drew. So it's all official. And another big thing that we do is we love to donate books to libraries. That's been a big passion of mine, because we get these books in kids' hands, and it helps hook them to reading, which is really important with kids, especially in today's world where there's so many other things besides reading that distracts children. It's really nice to have something fun and entertaining that hooks them to reading. And just briefly, here's some images from some of our conventions. Local Millie is up at the top, in the top left, when we had our first unofficial convention here and got to meet her. I have a website. If you want to learn anything about Nancy Drew, you can find a lot of things at nancydrewsleuth.com. I published a book called Clues for Real Life, The Classic Wit and Wisdom of Nancy Drew. And I've published a lot of articles on Nancy Drew and Millie, Smithsonian, LA Times, different places, as I've been working on researching a biography about Millie. This was my collection at home during a Halloween party. Before I donated it, and this was part of it, but it was a lot of the books that I had at the time. I was really excited to be able to donate to the library here in 2019 most of my entire collection of over 5,000 items, and I have added to it since then. As I said, I still collect for it. If you have not made it up to the children's section on the second floor, you can see a lot of it on display. Okay, so now we're going to move into my presentation for today, and there may be a little overlap from yesterday for those of you who were here yesterday, but I'm going to use images in a slightly different way. I just want to hit some highlights, because it's been, if you can believe it, 95 years that this series has been in publication, and Nancy Drew has gone through so many different decades and eras of different types of styles, different types of writing, different types of series, different writers, different illustrators, and it all has a cohesive, foundation that started in the beginning in 1930. But it's amazing that we're here 95 years later in many ways. Over 600 cases solved since 1930. I thought it would be fun to just look back at some fun sleuthing scenes from the classic books. Nancy on stakeouts, and going up to spooky attics. I mean, these are the trappings of a fun Nancy Drew mystery that we loved. Being followed, having her car stuck, eavesdropping, wearing her famous spike heels that she broke a window and mysterious letter with to help escape, being locked in places, being unmasked by villains, all these kind of cliffhanger, perilous moments that we loved. evading, this was so funny, evading villains by hanging off a bridge underneath them. She always had a phone threat to stay off the case or else, or somebody came to the door and menaced poor Hannah. And then there's the beautiful images from the books, the covers of the books that we have treasured all these years. Some of the early ones by Russell Tandy, where she's just so iconic. And if you haven't seen it up there on the left, The Secret in the Old Attic, the original art that Mike so generously loaned is here on display. You can see that. And then, of course, over time, Nancy's look changed. These were Rudy Nappy's takes on these particular books when he redid covers, where she sort of became mortician or redheaded and had the little trendy flip hairdo, the lime green dress on Old Clock. And so it's fun to look back at the covers. Many of them had 3 cover art, some had just 2, one had 4. But it's really fun to see how she evolved over time through the different decades. As we get into the 60s, and here we are in the 70s. And just briefly, a few fun things that we've learned from Nancy Drew all these years. When you're unusually good at what you do, the police will yearn for your women's intuition. From Leaning Chimney. If someone's trying to buy a house and it suddenly becomes haunted, it's probably not a coincidence. You can always talk a loyal friend into joining you in your schemes and ruses. Yes, she could. Even poor Bess. When your chums start to bicker, you can always diffuse the situation by changing the subject to less stressing topics like counterfeiters and thieves. When people irritate you, it's best to stifle a snarky retort and not let them get the best of you. You know you're clues obsessed when you can't imagine a vacation without a mystery to solve. She always had a mystery when on vacation. And red lipstick makes a great window SOS when you've been kidnapped and stolen away on a plane, because you know there's always lots of planes going by that might see that. Then you might get rescued. When your home is burglarized, it's always a good idea to indulge in a midnight snack of angel food cake and fruit juice. So now let's segue into historical moments in time over the last 95 years. I'm going to hit the big ones. There's a lot of littler ones, and if you go to my website in the history section, I have a huge timeline over the years of some really neat things that have happened in Nancy Drew's world. But here's a few of the really big ones that maybe had a little more melodrama and suspense with them. Well, first, let's go to Edward Stratemeyer. He invented Nancy Drew, and is sort of the driving force at the beginning of creating the series and the character. And here's Millie when she was younger and writing these books, the original ghostwriter. And so in the beginning, what was so important was what I called the Drew team. And just briefly, this is the creator, the writers, the illustrators, Stratemeyer's family, the publishers. So we have Edward Stratemeyer top, then Mildred Wirt Benson, who wrote the originals, Russell Tandy next to her, who illustrated the originals, Stratemeyer's daughter Edna on the right, in the middle Harriet on the left, his other daughter, far right Grace Horton, the model for Nancy Drew. The bottom is Stratemeyer's assistant on the left, Harriet Otis Smith, and Walter Carrig, who wrote 3 Nancy Drew books when Millie refused to take a pay cut during the 30s, and then the publishers of the book. All of these people were extremely talented people and were in the right place at the right time to create something very phenomenal and set the foundation for all these decades later that we're still talking about Nancy Drew. The real breakout star of all of this has always sort of been Millie. She was like a real-life Nancy Drew. So the big highlights in Nancy's history, the Great Depression was a huge one, but it didn't seem to get Nancy Drew down. There were a lot of other series that went out of print or were paused during this time period because they just couldn't sell them. Sales were down in publishing. But Nancy Drew was doing extremely well. The stock market crashed in October of 29. Right after the books were published, April 28, 1930, Stratemeyer passed away, another big highlight in Nancy Drew's history. not even 2 weeks after the publishing of this series, which would go on to be extremely popular, that I don't think he ever would have expected this to be the case all these years later. He dies, and it throws everything into turmoil at the syndicate. World War II, another huge issue with publishing because of paper shortages. And they had to use cheaper pulp paper that aged and became very brittle over time. But it's really neat if you collect some of the books during the 40s, and they have the stamp inside about the wartime conditions. Then we fast forward to 1980, where the syndicate has switched publishers from Grosset and Dunlap to Simon & Schuster. And it's a big deal because Grosset suddenly sees this book in print from another publisher that's a Nancy Drew book. And they had been advertising it in the back of the very last one that they published. So you don't want to advertise your competition's books, right? So they changed the printings to refer back to Old Clock because she switched publishers. Harriet was not happy with Grosset, wasn't happy with the royalty rates that didn't change over decades, and was given kind of an unfair deal. And she also was not happy they weren't going to do a lot of publicity for Nancy's 50th anniversary in 1980. And Simon & Schuster swooped in and had a sweetheart deal for them, and Harriet was excited, and they switched publishers. But it caused a big ruckus. Grosset, who tried to basically sue and regain copyright over the series, didn't work out. The final ruling, basically, they got to keep reprinting all those 56 books they always printed, and then Simon & Schuster and the syndicate got to do what they wanted with all future books. And so, you know, it worked out for both sides in many ways, but Mildred got to go testify at the trial, and that was kind of a big thing, though it wasn't publicized out in the news, that particular aspect of it. And then we get to 1993, when there was the Nancy Drew Conference at the University of Iowa in Iowa City.
You know, there was going to be a distinguished alumni receive a huge award, and they discovered that Carolyn Keene had gone to their school, basically. Now, some people at the school knew, but others didn't. And they realized they had this famous alumni that not only wrote Nancy Drew, but all these other books. He was a journalist and had this amazing writing career. And so they put together this conference, and 500 people from all over came. It was academic, it was fan-based, but the publicity was widespread across the country and in Canada. And Millie was very hesitant at first to even go to this because she was worried about Simon & Schuster. She was worried if she spoke about being Carolyn Keene, that they would do something legally to her or sue her. And so out of this conference, which she did participate in, was born an agreement with Simon & Schuster. Most of it is confidential, but the public part of it is that they would recognize her in books that she wrote or books based on books that she wrote. And so some of that has been held up on there, and some of the books they did not put the acknowledgement in, I discovered. But anyhow, the point is she became widely recognized at this point as being Carolyn Keene to the masses. But there's also one you might not have heard of. It's called The Great Madge Sterling Caper versus Nancy Drew. Now, I have to take you back to the early 30s and a little before that into 1929.
So when Millie was writing for the syndicate, she started out writing Ruth Fielding, and that was in the mid-20s, after she answered an ad Stratemeyer ran in the Editor looking for writers. Well, at the same time, she had written a lot of short stories, but she hadn't written books. So Ruth Fielding was her first. And then, of course, Stratemeyer passed away, and his daughters ended up taking over the syndicate and running it because of the Depression, and they couldn't find a buyer. So at the same time, Millie was writing books for the syndicate, like Nancy Drew and Ruth Fielding. She also wrote some other series, and one of them was called Doris Force. It was just a very short-lived series that didn't do very well. But it came to basically, by the early 30s, Millie had written about 17 books, syndicate and her own. She also had a series, very short-lived series called the Ruth Darrow series. That was a pretty big deal that she landed through another publisher. And so basically, it came to be, it was the Depression, and so she had written the first 7 books, and it was around 1931.
And what happened was let's see, how do I put this? So Stratemeyer was very good with his ghostwriter because he had been doing this for many, many years, right? He knew how to finesse them. He knew how to handle them well. He was kind of like a mentor. He was very kind to them. He would give them bonuses at the end of the year because a lot of these writers, they often had other jobs, but they relied on writing these books for a flat fee that was very well paid at the time. But also the bonuses were very helpful. And especially as we were getting towards the Great Depression in those early years, this meant something. But he also, when they returned their manuscripts and their stories, he knew how to criticize, but in a nice way. And he knew how to praise them. And they really respected him. And he helped a lot of them really formulate their writing career and their writing style. He was very much with Millie in those Ruth Fielding years leading up to 1930 when Nancy Drew came out. He was very much helpful to her in guiding her writing, and she was very appreciative and respectful of that. And so he kind of commanded respect. When he died and his daughters took over the company, they were not editors, they were not writers. And so they had to kind of come into their own through several missteps and other issues that they would have over time. But they also didn't have that same finesse. And their criticisms were a little more caustic sounding. And you read the letters that exist at the New York Public Library, where they have the Stratemeyer archives.
Stratemeyer could criticize but then praise at the same time and kind of lighten that. The sisters weren't quite so, they didn't have that finesse. And so it could come across very blunt sometimes. And I think Millie, because she had her undergrad in English, she had her journalism degree, she had been a writer for many years, she kind of felt like they weren't in the same league as their dad, and they weren't. And they were trying, they were learning on the job. Harriet had a little bit of experience editing for her father, but he was very Victorian-minded. He didn't really see a place for them working or having a career. Now, Harriet, I think, blossomed because she kind of loved actually being able, she had a family, she had a husband that provided, but I think she enjoyed going to an office and being able to do this. It was sort of a slight dream of hers that she could do something like that and not just be at home. And Edna was more of a free spirit. And so anyhow, because of the Depression, because publishing sales were dropping, basically the sisters wanted to institute a pay cut among the ghostwriters. So Millie had been paid around $125 for the first several Nancy Drew books, and they asked her to take a $25 reduction in pay, so $100. So in 1931,
she received a letter about the pay cut. So this is kind of fuzzy, so bear with me here. A lot of the letters in the library are degraded or they're carbons and they're not the best. And so there's going to be a period where I just talk about them and don't show them because they're not very legible. But this one, from 1931, so she is replying to the letter she received about the pay cut. And she is sorry. And they're going back and forth. There was back and forth for a little bit where Millie is refusing to take the pay cut. And she's enjoyed her association with the syndicate and it regrets the interruption, and she realizes the difficult times they're going through with the Depression. And so she basically says, I would be willing to accept some reduction were not the amount paid already as low as I feel I could accept with justice to myself. Since writing you, I've signed for a new girl series and have other work in prospect. In my negotiations with the publisher, I reserve time for my syndicate work, but unless I hear from you soon, I must fill up this vacancy. So they're going back and forth, and Millie's sort of trying to use this publishing deal she's got on the side as maybe like a bargaining chip for them to go, oh, she's in demand, maybe we should pay her more, So
Millie's kind of trying to artfully negotiate, and at the same time,
the sisters aren't exactly wanting to work with her. They're both stubborn on both sides. So it goes back and forth. But basically, Millie just wants to have justice for herself. And this kind of gets me to a point of the whole Nancy Drew legacy, is knowing when you read these books, you get life lessons from them, you get inspiration,
they mean something to you in some ways. They might motivate you to do more in your life and be more of a go-getter like Nancy. But there's life lessons involved in the books, but also in the people behind them, and people like Millie, who were real life Nancy Drews.
And one of the biggest lessons is knowing your worth, knowing the value of your work.
And standing up for yourself and the value of your work. And this was a big pivotal moment because Millie stood up for herself. She had been, and her work had improved greatly. She had published her own books by this point, and they were still paying her $125. And she probably was worth, and her writing was worth more than that. And she accepted it, but when they went to do the pay cut, that's where she took her stand. So that's why Millie only wrote the first 7 and not books 8, 9, and 10, because of this standoff with the syndicate that lasted several years during the Depression. Basically, the syndicate had Walter Carrig, this Navy man who wrote those 3 Nancy Drew books, on staff already doing a couple of books. So they just switched to Carrig and had him write the next 3 Nancy Drew books. He became a difficult personality for them. And you know, it's one thing to have somebody be able to step in like that, but it's another thing when he's a real rascal, and he really was. And the letters for Carrig in the New York Public Library, they're just hilarious, the way he would write them. He was very humorous. And I don't know if the sisters ever quite got his humor, but they are hysterical to read. But basically, the back and forth, there was stubbornness. Millie refused, but in some of the back and forth letters, which I'm not showing because of the quality of the image, they're just not very good. Basically, you know, Millie just really stood up for herself. But the sisters were disappointed because trying to start over with an existing series with another writer is a little more difficult. You've got to kind of prepare them, you've got to train them a little bit and work with them. And with Millie, it was very seamless. So they really didn't want to lose her for that continuity issue, but Carrig's writing was pretty darn good. So it kind of just flowed well, luckily. But the thing is, Millie refers to this series that she's working on selling to another publisher. Well, it ended up being Madge Sterling. There was a 3-book set called the Madge Sterling series, and it was published by Goldsmith. And basically, it came out as a 3-volume breeder set in 1932. It was a little shorter than a Nancy Drew book, so they were thinner, but she was paid around $100 per book, which was good for the size of the book. But she was using this as a bargaining chip. And I think in Millie's mind, she sort of thought, you know, maybe if I make a great success of the Madge Sterling series, you know, I've already written some of my own books that did well, and I've had Nancy Drew under my belt, and maybe, you know, I don't have to worry about writing for Nancy Drew anymore. I can just go off with Madge Sterling, and maybe she'll be a great rival to Nancy Drew. Now, the Madge Sterling books were neat, they were good, but they didn't fare well, probably because of the Depression also. And Goldsmith was kind of a cheap reprint publisher in a way. They didn't put a lot into the artwork. The paper quality of the books is kind of poor. And so she just didn't have a fighting chance with that particular one. So the series didn't take off. It was just a 3-volume breeder set. And so between that and a couple of years of the Depression wearing on you, you know, eventually Millie came back to the syndicate. They were tired of Carrig and dealing with his antics. Millie probably could have used the money, you know, to support herself. So she kind of eventually acquiesced and came back to write book number 11. And I think they were all relieved at this point. The Depression had worn a lot of people down. The thing is, with the Depression, the sisters had been writing to other ghostwriters that worked for their company before they reached out to Millie about the pay cut. But none of these ghostwriters knew each other, so nobody knew what anybody was doing. But you look at the records in the library in New York, and you can see interesting things that they're writing to these other people. So they probably, you know, knew she wasn't going to know what was going on with these other writers. But they were writing some of the other ghosts, and those ghosts were also saying, no, we're not going to take a pay cut. So they lost some significant writers at the time because of their policies. Millie brought up the fact that they weren't paying bonuses like Stratemeyer used to, as did some of these other writers. And I think the problem was that the sisters expected to command the same respect that their father got just automatically by being there and being his daughters. But you kind of have to earn that, especially when you're not
don't have the finesse that Stratomayor had, and the sisters were kind of to rub people the wrong way easily. And so,
You know, it all worked out. Millie came back to write for the series, but she did stand up for herself, and I think that's just an important part of this history, that she wanted to, you know, do herself justice. So I think we can all take a lesson for that. You know the value of your work, know the value of your worth, and stand up for yourself when you feel like, you know, that's an appropriate thing to do. But also, as Millie ended up doing, be willing to compromise when you have to survive and make a living. Sometimes you have to take a pay cut or make
make a different change to be able to continue doing what you're doing. And so I think that's a really good lesson that we learned in this.
Yeah, but this Madge Sterling series, nobody really has ever realized how it was kind of that bargaining chip. And she really kind of thought that it might take off. But the Depression was really hard on everybody. And it killed a lot of series and just kind of squelched creative input and creativity
At the time, until things sort of turned around. But I feel like, and some people just don't know a lot
about it. Some have referred to this as sort of a myth that she quit writing these books
because of the pay cut, but it's all there in black and white in the letters. I mean, it's all completely spelled out at the time that this happened. But I think fate has a strange way of working itself out, that Millie comes back to the series and is able to continue writing, you know, the rest of the books she wrote. But what if Millie hadn't come back to the series? What then? It's kind of interesting to ponder that, because what if they'd had to stick with Walter Carrick? He was a good writer, but what if they were so fed up with Walter, which they were in a way? Who would they have gotten to come in? You know, there was Leslie McFarland, who was writing the Hardy Boys series. Because Millie quit writing for 3 years, the Dana Girls series, which the sisters created, as some of you collect and have read, and also by Carolyn Keene, she didn't get to start writing the Dana Girls series. It went to the Hardy Boys author,
Leslie McFarland, in the beginning. Had she not taken a pay cut, she would have started out with the Dana Girls series, which is interesting.
McFarland hated writing the Dana Girls. He did not like it at all. So he only wrote
the first 4, I think. And then Millie went back and was asked to write starting from there on. So it kind of makes you wonder, would McFarland have picked up the pen as Carolyn Keene? Would it have been one of the other ghosts? Would they have found someone else? And had they done that, where would we be 95 years later? What would Nancy Drew look like? Would she still be around? Would this series have faltered in the 40s when the paper shortages happened? Because there were other series that went out of print at the time. I have hope that she would have continued on in some form, and we might still be here today 95 years later. But I think with Millie's writing and her zest for Nancy Drew's character being so bold and independent and so daring and just so out there in the world, especially in those early books, that's really what helped make Nancy the success that she has been all these years later. Why we're still talking about her, why we're collecting these books, why we're coming to these conventions. And so, of course, I never thought at 10 years old that we would be here today and doing all of this. But I just think it's interesting to ponder how it could have turned out all those years later had something changed. So maybe fate just has a strange way of working itself out. But again, that lesson is just know your value, know your worth. And also consider Nancy Drew as a role model. I mean, she really is. Just maybe skip the part about chasing suspects down dark alleys late at night in heels or something, or getting locked in closets where nobody knows where you are. Outside of that, consider her a role model. But as Nancy Drew fans and people who talk about the series to other people, who share them with kids and others, who pass them down for generations, remember that you too are all role models out there. You know, you love Nancy Drew for a reason. You probably share some characteristics with her. I don't think we've got a lot of Stumpy Downs and Ada Tophams in the room right now. You're more like Nancy Drew, right? Or her friends Bess and George. Maybe you identify with them. But consider the fact that you're also role models here, and you have influence on others in your lives. And there's probably a lot of people, who look up to you as a role model. And remember that going forward, that, you know, as we get towards the 100th anniversary and beyond, that there are people you can inspire to, like Nancy Drew did, through your collecting, through your passion for Nancy Drew, and how you approach, you know, how you live your life and what you do in your life. So those are good lessons we can learn from Nancy Drew. Just after all of this, and she came back to work for the syndicate. Let's see, there we go. There's Carrig. I skipped over that one. There was Madge Sterling, by the way. I'm going to go ahead because we're running out of time. But Millie went on to come back to the syndicate and write the rest of these books. There were a few near the end she did not write. They tried some other ghostwriters out for different reasons. That's drama for another day. But she went on to write a bunch of her own books and series and a lot more syndicate series, 135 published books over her entire career, and for syndicate and a lot on her own. She here locally became a journalist in the 40s, went to work when the men went off to war. She needed a job. Her husband had a series of strokes and became an invalid and couldn't really provide, and so her book writing wasn't enough. She had to get a job. So she went to work for the Toledo Times, but she had a journalist background, so it was a natural switch. So here's a press pass from her, from the Blade. This is her doing an article on the Pepsi Skyrider flying in the plane, the pilot. Here she is in an open airplane. She just went on to have a lot of her own adventures. Here she is at the Blade. Here she is having a little fun. She was very serious and very professional, so seeing this photo is just fun. She's just cutting up a little bit at work. Maybe she was like, oh boy, a bunch of Nancy fans are here to get their books autographed. This flying in her plane, she became a pilot. So after this whole mess with Madge Sterling and the Depression and the pay cut, she went on to have a very adventurous life, traveling down to Central America, living that Nancy Drew spirit of adventure, checking out all the Mayan and all the other archaeology down there, even applying to be a journalist in space.
Her NAF application is here, third floor in the Toledo Rare Book Room, if you ever want to read through it. Some of the recommendations from her coworkers are really fun. Her typewriter's in the Smithsonian. There have been articles
About her over the years.
as early as 1931 about her writing. Articles when she became outed as fully outed as being Carolyn Keene, the trial, all of the things that happened, the rivalry between her and Harriet Adams, who wrote many of the later books, that conference I mentioned, you know, getting recognition. In this particular
Copy of the book based on
the conference,
she dedicated it to her daughter Peggy. And this basically was a book that covered all the presentations and what went on at the conference and how it came to be, and Millie. And she wrote to her daughter Peggy, "This is a fine account of how my identity as Nancy Drew's author became known. Millie Wirt Benson," quote, "the real Nancy Drew," is how she signed it. And I thought that was really cool. So if you want to really get in depth on the Madge Sterling, I just touched the surface at my Nancy Drew blog, which you can find off my website. I have an article that quotes things from the letters and really gets into all the interesting things that were going on behind the scenes. You can check that out. My website has a lot of resources. Here, there's the Toledo here at the library, the Rare Book Room, my collection, and the University of Iowa Women's Archive has a great archive of some of her papers. So if you want to delve into it further, there's a few resources. And so that's the end of that. But I just want to say thank you all so much for coming to this.
Question?
Oh, yeah, sure.
I know that kind of maybe the last book she wrote was maybe Deadly Deadline or Dangerous Deadline or something like that.
Oh, right.
So, you know, towards after those years, did she really try to write books, or did she just stick to, I'm a journalist and I work for the Toledo Blade? I was kind of wondering, did
Right.
she kind of consciously say, I'm not going to do books anymore, I just want to be a journalist?
It kind of came about several fold. So she did write through the 50s. She had some scout series, younger and older scouts. And then she had these one-off books like Dangerous Deadline, which won her a huge Dodd Mead Prize award and was serialized in Boy's Life over 3 issues. There was a book called Quarry Ghost and just some little ones there at the very end. And what kind of happened was 2 things. One, her second husband, George Benson, passed away in 1959. And that hit her really hard. They had just had a phenomenal relationship, and they like to explore. They like to go dancing at the old Commodore Perry here downtown. Just so many things they did together, and it was really, really hard on her. She had lost 2 husbands, and I think it threw her writing for a bit of a loop. She kind of, not say writer's block, but just sort of felt not as inspired. And then 2, she did have a few books that she had worked on or had manuscripts for. She was having a hard time farming them out to publishers because her style of writing, things had changed, and kids' books were becoming, even then, a little more different, a little more or less fantasy and entertainment, and getting a little more real, even back then a little bit. And so her style of writing was a little different than the way things were becoming. And I don't think she wanted to transition into that style. She just kind of preferred the way she had done it. So she had some rejections there at the end on a few of her manuscripts. And between that and the husband, and then just the journalism career really going gangbusters for her, I think she just let it go at that point. But Grosset and Dunlap acquired her Penny Parker series after several. It went from Couples and Leon, which went defunct, Platt and Monk, then it went defunct, and there's several things, and it ended up at Grosset and Dunlap, and they acquired it. And so right before the trial in 1980, in the late 70s, they were talking to her about revising them, and she did work on revising a little bit on some of the first books, because they were really considering publishing those, especially if they couldn't publish any more Nancy Drew books. And even then, though, she was kind of, that was way later down the line in her years, and it didn't go anywhere. They got to keep printing Nancy Drew, so they just dropped the whole Penny Parker thing. But that was the only thing that really ever cropped up later on, was getting the Penny Parkers possibly back in print, which I think that would have been neat. It was her favorite series she wrote, and I'm sure she would have been really proud to get them back in print, but it didn't happen, so.
First of all, thank you for this weekend. As a Nancy Drew nerd, I have just been nerding out. This has just been phenomenal, and I can't thank you. You're welcome. In awe of how much you know. It's been lovely. Apologies if you did say this because I stepped out for a moment.
No worries.
Did Millie have children? Does she have remaining family in Toledo?
She had 1 daughter, and she is deceased. She passed away in 2013. And but no other children, and she never remarried after George. I think she was just so sad over the whole, because she'd lost her first husband and then the second one. I think she just focused on her career. She was always focused on it anyhow, but she laser focused on that career, and it just kind of kept her going. She does have cousins in Iowa, though, that are really into the history and preserving things. So they still have her childhood home.
No one here in Toledo?
No, there's no one left in Toledo.
Because Peggy didn't have any children.
No, Peggy never married or had any children. So they just kind of stopped with Peggy in that immediate family.
I would love to see a list of the 135 books that she wrote.
You can find it on my website. Right, in the section on Millie, it's nancydrewsleuth.com/mildredwertbenson.html, but there's a link on the site too to that. You can go through and look at all the books she wrote. There's a whole list of everything and a little bit of information about the books.
Because I have a book called The Twin Ring Mystery.
Yeah, one of her books, right.
It's so a la Nancy Drew. It's like the same formula.
Right.
It's a lovely book.
Right. You can get a real sense of Nancy Drew in a lot of the books she wrote.
I was wondering, when she came back for book 11, did she get the $125 or did she stick at $100?
Actually, they offered her, I'm trying to remember, I'm not going to mess this up. I think it was a little bit less than 100, and she was willing to finally, and that's what I said. Sometimes when you fight the good fight, you know, but the depression's happening and you need to pay the bills. You kind of have to compromise sometimes, but that 3-year stand was pretty good. You know, they wanted her back. She didn't lose the job. They could have just said, oh, forget her. I mean, Edna had a lot of issues with her. Edna thought she could just do everything, and she wasn't as well trained, obviously, as Millie. So they kind of batted heads in a way. She thought Millie had a swell head and that she was just, you know, but that wasn't really. Millie just knew she was a good writer. But, you know, basically, that's just kind of, I think she just kind of had to come back. She needed the work. And she had been used to writing the books, so it was something familiar she could jump back into and knew how to do it. But, you know, when she did come back, one quick thing, in the letters back and forth when they're offering her book 11, she asked them to send her volumes 9 and 10 that Carrick wrote, just to catch up on the last couple volumes before writing 11. She didn't ask for number 8. So I suspect she went out and purchased number 8 to see what her rival ghostwriter was doing with Nancy Drew. Of course, she didn't know who Carrick was till around 1950 when he was outed as being Carolyn Keene. But I thought that was so funny when I realized she didn't ask for book number 8. So.
And you said her cousins has her home. Are they living in it, or is it?
I believe there is some family still living in it. There was a cousin that passed, but she has a whole family and everything. And they don't have it open for historic tours. They've talked about it, possibly trying to get it on a historic registry and have it open for tours, but I don't know that they'll do that for sure or not. It might be down the road a while. Mm-hmm.
How long did she live here, Doria? When did she come here from Iowa? And is the house around her school?
She went from Iowa to Cleveland and lived in Cleveland through 1938. So the real first Nancy Drew books were written in Cleveland. Millie came here in 1938 and was here till she died in 2002. So she wrote books 17 through 25 and 30 here in Toledo. The rest, with the exception of 2, were written in Cleveland. 2 of them she wrote back in Ladora on visits home. The first book, Old Clock, was written in Ladora, Iowa. The book number 12 was also written there.
I remember hearing a story on Ghost, and I think they were talking about the Blade, and they were saying that the Blade has ghosts.
Right.
The ghost that they were trying to say that lived there is Millie.
Right. Yeah, so several years ago there was an article in the Blade, and I have Google News alerts on Nancy Drew, so I got this, and I thought, Millie's haunting the Blade? What in the world? I had been there before, and I'm kind of a skeptic on that anyhow, but I reached out to the one who wrote it and asked her about this, and then one of the security guards kind of has a feeling that, and he has a little pendulum and has done some things, and thinks that Millie and some other old timers might be haunting, especially the Toledo Times building across the street that's kind of unused. So then the next year, myself and a few others, and Nancy from the library here, I don't know if Nancy's in here right now, but she joined us, and we did a ghost hunt one night with a local ghost hunting group, and she wrote a second article about that happening. We did not hear anything or see anything. It was, you know, it was interesting to be in the old Times building because it's kind of crumbling in places and just has a lot of history to it. But I just thought that was kind of fascinating. Also, Harriet Adams, Stratemeyer's daughter, is said to haunt her farm. Her ghost is supposed to haunt her farm that she wrote a lot of books in. So it's kind of interesting that these ghost writers might have turned into ghosts someday. I don't know.
Yes.
I have a question, but I also wanted to say first, my sister made a 1,000-piece puzzle of all the Nancy Drew book covers and framed it for me and gave it to me for my birthday.
Oh, that's nice.
Gift I ever got in my life. My question is, were George and Mess, I had such an affinity for both of them, were they real life people that Millie knew, or?
So George and Bess were Nancy Drew's friends that showed up in Shadow Ranch. And this was after Edward died. He outlined through number 4, but Shadow Ranch had to be completed. So
His assistant, Harriet Otis Smith,
finished the outline for Shadow Ranch.
And this is where the characters appear. So we believe Harriet Otis Smith created the two characters.
And I suspect, though I
Don't know for sure, but I suspect that they were loosely based on Stratemeyer's daughters. Harriet was rather blunt, or could be, like George.
and Edna was definitely a best. So it's plausible she might have just kind of been inspired by the Stratemeyer's daughters.
Did you want to answer that woman's question about Millie's home in Toledo?
Oh, about where she lived. Okay,
So she lived in an address for like
2 years on Upton Avenue, kind of over near the Old Orchard area. Then they moved into a house in 1940 in Old Orchard, and she lived in that house until she passed away. So that was, 62 years she was in that house. A lot of history in that house. They built on a large writing room along the garage upstairs that she had as her writing room, kind of converted it. And there was a spooky attic that goes from one of the second floor rooms up. In the closet, there's a staircase going up to this attic area, which was kind of cool. So those are some fun facts about that. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much for coming, for supporting all of this. And I guess if you're, thank you. If you're ready to head upstairs to the McMaster area, they're going to have pizza and salad and then the movie. And I believe you can take your food into the auditorium, right? Right.